Well, it was the telephone company a couple of decades ago that suggested that using the telephone, making a long distance call, was the next best thing to being there. Well, the truth is, those of us who professionally walk alongside the bereaved know that there isn't any substitute for being there, that the gift of our presence, the rapport we build, the physical proximity, sharing space, and breathing the same air with one who is suffering crisis and loss is indeed the greatest gift that we give. But nevertheless, those of us who counsel professionally realize that we are dependent in large measure on the approaches and, in fact, the integration of approaches popularized in psychotherapy throughout the 20th century. You can't really even take history of psychotherapy without encountering the person considered by many to be the father of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud. It was Freud who wrote Mourning and Melancholia, and while we have now dismissed his primary premise, and that is that if one is going to successfully negotiate the bereavement and loss process, one must deconnect or break the attachment bond between the person who has died and I who live, and reinvest that in an entirely different relationship. And while that Freudian concept of breaking the attachment bond has long since been dismissed by most grief counselors today, we nevertheless owe a debt of gratitude to him for getting the ball rolling and getting us talking about the process of grief itself. Carl Rogers, in the middle part of the 20th century, provided a great gift to those of us who counsel the bereaved. His client-centered therapy held to the premise that it is the client, not the therapist, who is the expert. And in fact, most grief counselors today would say that it is the person with whom we are working who is the best expert on his or her grief, not me, regardless of my education, my training, my experience, but you, the one who is grieving, is the expert on your loss, the emotional, the cognitive, the physical, and the spiritual components of that loss as experienced by you. Now, indeed, Albert Ellis and his rational emotive behavior therapy and his ABC approach to thinking about any particular issue is also helpful to us that try to walk alongside the bereaved. In the ABCs, Ellis talked about that we are faced with an adversity, and to that adversity we bring specific beliefs. The adversity that we experience, the beliefs that we bring, lead to the consequences or the outgrowth of those beliefs as applied to that particular adversity. Now, Ellis would have said for sure there are roots of whatever we are facing today in our childhood and our family of origin, but that primarily it is our beliefs that need to be challenged if there's going to be any real change in our behavior or our thought process. Indeed, the work of Murray Bowen and Salvador Minuchin, Virginia Satir, the great pioneers of the family systems movement in the 50s and 60s and 70s, give us a great storehouse of material to work with as we approach people who are bereaved. And the reason for that is that we do not grieve as individuals. We grieve in systems. We grieve in families and work communities, in church or synagogue or temple, faith communities, in other words. We grieve in schools. We grieve surrounded by other people. And the experiences and the responses of the people around us to the loss that we share also affects how we deal with the loss, both for good and for ill. It's one of the reasons that family systems understandings are so important to us as we walk alongside bereaved people. Understanding that the notion of boundaries, for example, that every family has boundaries in it. Those may be from on one extreme, an extraordinarily enmeshed family relationship where one person does absolutely nothing or hardly even thinks an independent thought apart from the approval of the other people in the system. all the way to the other extreme of very diffuse boundaries, very disengaged kinds of family systems, where frankly there's very little attention paid to what other people think, and I operate fairly independently of what others around me might think or how they might apprise this particular loss. Family systems suggest to us another important component for us who do counseling with bereaved people. That component is that we are coaches, we are teachers, we are not experts. The client is the person with whom I work, and that client exists in the context of community, whether that's family or some other community that he or she is part of. And in fact, an important suggestion made, I believe, by family systems theory to the work we do with grieving people is to embrace and learn from the client how he or she may feel supported or not supported, how they perceive to be cared for by the other people in that system. How is their grief different? How do they perceive other people to be grieving? How are others doing? And those are important aspects of the process for us to investigate and to encounter with our clients as we learn from them, as we help them think about what exactly they do in the context of systems. Now, the cognitive therapy approach of Aaron Beck and others in the 1960s and beyond gave rise to much of the thinking that we rely on today in a later modification of that is called cognitive behavioral therapy. But the work of Beck and others, especially with depression, anxiety, those kinds of disorders, particularly useful to us as we come alongside grieving people, because they suggest that as Beck did, that it is our cognitions, it is our thoughts that largely produce the disorders in our lives. Therefore, change your thinking to change your behavior or to change your outlook. A popular way of saying that today is think yourself into a new way of acting or a new way of being. And that has its roots, its genesis really, in cognitive therapy and the approaches popularized by Beck and by others. Now, by the 1970s and into the 1980s, especially with the advent, the arising of managed care in the United States, we found that brief interventions had to be developed in much fuller measure than they ever had before, and that gave rise really to the solution-focused brief therapy movement. Solution-focused therapy also apprises the client to be the expert. It is the client who understands his coping skills, and it is the therapist's role really to draw those out, to celebrate the capacities, the strengths that the client has, to help him or her see the potential solutions to whatever the concerns are, whatever the presenting problem is that brought he or she to counseling in the first place. Solution-focused therapy asks the exception question. When is this not happening for you? In grief counseling, a question that I often ask clients is, what are the best times of the day or the week or the month for you? When do you not feel the weight of grief, if that happens for you at any particular time? And then to talk with the client about what sets that up and what are the precursors to that, or what are the things that may help that come about for him or her. Not so that they can avoid the grief, but so that they understand that in some ways they can create a container for their grief in a lot of ways. Another popular solution-focused question would be the miracle question. If I had a magic wand and I waved it today, how would life be different if this was no longer an albatross hanging about your neck? And then finally, the narrative therapy that has come about in the latter part of the 20th century that focuses on the story, the telling of the story, the celebrating of the story that we use so much in grief counseling, particularly helpful for us. So listen attentively, stress positive capacities, show respect for the client's experience, the client's story, help that client find solutions solutions to the concerns that brought him or her in, and help him or her to take stock of the beliefs and the assumptions that have been shattered so far in this loss.